I just want to start by doing a brief introduction of Dr. Justine Humphry. Dr. Humphry is a lecturer in digital cultures in the Digital Cultures program, the Department of Media and Communications at the University of Sydney. Right. And she has been studying about this anti-racism app, which I'm actually not very familiar with, and maybe some of us are not either. So we're really excited about this use of recent rise, and everybody's now having smartphones.
That's right.
And you know what we can do with these wonderful gadgets.
That's right.
So we're very much excited to have you here and to share with us your research and your wisdom.
Thank you. Thanks so much again. So in this talk, what I'd like to do is introduce the research that I carried out with my colleague, Associate Professor Alana Lenton. And we did some research on 5 anti-racism apps, mobile apps, that you can download onto your smartphone. 1 in the UK, 2 in France, and 2 Australian apps. And I'm going to share with you what we did, why we compared a number of apps across different countries, why we felt that was important, and what we found. So I've heard from Tamura Takanori that there is an interest in racial discrimination in Australia and the laws and policies that provide protections and ways to respond to acts of racial discrimination. So today I will also connect our research on anti-racism apps to the broader context of racism in Australia and Europe. So mobile media is seen to hold great promise for combating everyday racism because of their portability, their real-time mapping capability, and their presence in our pockets, as you say, the little gadgets in our pockets. This means that users of phones can react to incidents of everyday racism exactly when an act of racism occurs. So the live streaming and eyewitness video recordings of police shootings of Philandro Castile and Alton Sterling in the United States last year were made possible by smartphones. These were central to the witnessing and sharing of the recordings and also to the widespread social media response and condemnation of the treatment of Black Americans by US police. The Black Lives Matter movement on Twitter, you might be familiar with. It began its life as a Twitter hashtag, and it's very important because originally it emerged in response to the shooting of the black teenager Trayvon Martin by the US policeman George Zimmerman in 2012. In Australia, the Black Lives Matter movement gained a lot of support from Indigenous Australians who adopted the Twitter hashtag BLM to protest against the unfair treatment of Aboriginal young people by police and also in detention. So the BLM hashtag has become an umbrella term in an Australian context alongside other hashtags like Dondale, I'll explain more what that means later, and Stop Black Deaths in Custody, to protest and express anger about the racialised treatment of Aboriginal youth, especially after a video was leaked of how Aboriginal teenagers were treated in the Dondale Youth Detention Centre in the Northern Territory last year. This was a big incident, which I'll mention again later. The hashtag has been used to coordinate many protests in public settings. In June last year in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide and Brisbane, there were many protests. Here are some of the images of the street protests and also some of the reported social media commentary. All of these appeared in the same feature article in the Huffington Post Australia. You can see there the Black Lives Matter hashtag is being referenced in the Twitter tweet. So there's a very long history of discrimination against Aboriginals in Australia, dating back to European settlement. And as a group, Aboriginals have been the target of systematic denial of their culture and land rights. Aboriginal health and education indicators are still very low compared to other groups in Australia. And even up until the 1970s, children of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families were removed by the government, by Australian and state agencies and church missions. These removed children became known as the stolen generation. So these are some national statistics collected by the anti-racist charity All Together Now. And it shows the disparity in health and well-being between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. In Australia, we call this the gap. Without mobile technology and social media, the Black Lives Matter movement and the localised use of the BLM hashtag, especially by Aboriginal anti-racism and rights campaigners, would not have been possible. So while traditional forms of media, posters, videos and television have been used in campaigns against racism for many years, there's a growing interest in mobiles as tools for social transformation, particularly in fields like politics and health, and now less known, but also in fields like racism and anti-racism. But much of this is speculative. It's untested and unresearched. Nicole Grant has written about mobile apps as a new methodology for anti-racism. And she says that it's their everydayness, their capacity to activate understandings of racism in the everyday, that underpins their value for anti-racist education and also intervention. In Australia, as in many countries, including in Japan, this is enabled by the high use of mobiles. In Australia, there's more mobile subscriptions than there are people. And mobile phones are used to go online by 77% of Australians. So Alana Lenton, my colleague, and I, we set out to find out what these 5 mobile apps are doing. What are they continuing in terms of anti-racism strategies, but also what do they challenge or what do they rupture? What is new about them? And we were very interested in the meaning-making processes that contribute to the way that race and racism is framed and responded to. So we drew on I don't know if you know of the critical race scholar's work, Philomena Essed. She has written about everyday racism, and she defines everyday racism as the regular patterns of actions and social actions that activate the structure and ideology of racism in everyday life. So rather than thinking that racism is just something that applies to individuals who have a bad attitude, it's more something that is structural across all of society, in institutions, in policies and laws, and it expresses itself, it manifests in everyday speech and everyday gestures and everyday actions. That's one of the ways that it manifests. So how does the mobile app as a cultural artifact solidify or challenge particular ideas about race and racism? This was a key question. Also, we asked what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the mobile app for countering forms of everyday racism? And in what way do these apps build on or depart from established non-digital or older media for strategies to fight racism? So I'll just say a few words about our methodology before going on to tell you about our findings. We adopted a qualitative, cross-cultural comparative approach, because this allowed us to look at the similarities and differences between the apps, but also their political and legal context. So we argue, based on Alana Lenton's work, because this is very much her area, she does a lot of work on transnational racism and anti-racism, we argued that particular state formations and histories enact processes of racialization. And so our approach was very influenced by this idea that racism is a transnational but also a mediated phenomenon. Okay, it takes place in and through media. We carried out interviews with organisations, developers, and we will be doing further work on users. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And we also were interested to find out about who were the social actors involved in the development and the design of these apps, and how did they shape the app design and development. So in this, questions of identity and positionality were also important. We adopted Paul Duguay's Circuit of Culture as a guide, conceptual guide, for approaching the analysis along a number of fronts. So I come from a cultural studies and media background, so perhaps you might not be familiar with the Circuit of Culture. It includes 5 main points or moments that define the meaning and form of any cultural artefact. So Paul Dugay argues that every artefact goes through these different moments, whether it's production, consumption, regulation, representation, and identity. So to really understand an object, a piece of technology, a cultural form, you have to understand the different ways in which it is articulated across the circuit of culture. They did a very famous study of the Sony Walkman. So you might be interested in having a look at their, the way that they applied the circuit of culture to that analysis. We didn't adhere to these categories strictly, so we focused on the production and the design, but we also wanted to look at the political and the legal contexts, and we didn't feel that that was very well represented in the circuit of culture, so we're adding to it by also concentrating on the political and legal contexts. And we also wanted to find out about the representation of racism in those apps. So what was the understanding, the interpretation of racism in order to develop an anti-racism strategy? So you need to understand that to understand what kind of mechanisms to respond to racism, whether it's effective or not, but also who it's speaking to, who the audience is, who is the main audience. So one of our key findings was that a number of the apps shared a common feature, the ability to report an incident of racism. So the idea that you could report either as a witness, a bystander, seeing an act of racism, or a victim of racism. You could make a report of that incident. But we also found that even though this was a common feature, this could mean and do quite different things, and that this reflected and put into action different understandings of racism. So Kick It Out, this was the first app that we studied. This was developed by the UK-based organisation called Kick It Out at the end of the 2013-14 football season in the United Kingdom. And it was designed as a platform for reporting racially abusive behaviour during football matches. One of the main partners of the organisation, Kick It Out, is the Premier League, the main organisation for running football matches and teams in the United Kingdom. So the app allows for the monitoring and also the disciplining of football fans. In the words of Kick It Out Media and Communication Manager, it is a tool for self-policing of racism by football fans. So the ability to support self-policing is made possible by, oh, I'll just open that up again. Sorry, it must have a little something in it doesn't like. It's made possible by the everydayness of the mobile. Coming back to what Nicole Grant says about the idea that the mobile is just taken for granted. It's unremarkable. When we see people using mobiles now, we don't pay any attention to them. It's probably more remarkable if they're not using one. So this is really important for the purpose of being able to make a report confidentially, because you don't actually know if someone is making a report. It's disguised. So this is